Just like in the Rime of the Ancient Mariners, so many Wordsworth poems, the climactic scene of Frankenstein is this moment of the halted traveler, in a famous term of Wordsworth criticism. That's sort of the iconic Wordsworth scenarios. The traveler's halted by this encounter with a stranger. And here it says, an encounter with a stranger. The creature would enter into the scene that he has been spectating upon. So it's really a scene of applying the spectacle of an encounter between the spectacle and real life. I'm a traveler in want of a little rest. You'd greatly oblige me if you would allow me to remain a few minutes before the fire. So what's really amazing here is the way in which this overlap between the imaginary spectacle, the fantastical spectacle, is seen through the kind of cinematic chink in the wall, or the novelistic fantasy that plays out before the creature spectator. How this overlaps now with our reading, insofar as the real life, this conversation plays out with a blind man who can't see the creature, just like us. So we can't see the creature. We just relate to the creature through words, just like DeLacy. So that's a really powerful, so another like reader surrogate. I've talked a lot about the reader surrogate of Margaret reading Walton's letters. That this is also a reader surrogate in the blind figure of DeLacy. And language plays a big, crucial part in this, in their interaction. By your language, stranger, I suppose you are my countryman. You are common membership or common nationality is manifest in our common language. Who we are is manifest in how we speak. The old man continues, if you will unreservedly confide to me the particulars of your tale, I perhaps may be of use in undeceiving your friends. I'm blind, but there is something in your words which convinces me you are sincere. So sincerity is embedded in words. Personhood is embedded in words. I think that's a proposition that the book, again, the novel is really testing. It's testing in this scene. It's testing, I think, in our reaction as readers to this scene. I think we can't help but feel like the DeLacy family fails the test. And so what does that say about us? About our expectations for ourselves? I think it reveals something about language, or suggests something about language that's to be tested. It suggests a promise of language to overcome the boundaries set up by prejudice. The prejudice against the disregard of minority bodies, of racialized bodies. And this is really amazing, that we are more intimately connected through text than we would be even in person. It's the personal interaction that gets in the way of the communication that they're able to establish here in words. Um, so, so capacity or promise of language to kind of universal acknowledgement of personhood, um, I, a universal respect. And I think that's a deep part of the romantic critique is like social critique is exposing the hypocrisy. Exposing hypocrisy in language is a way about trying to force people to live up to the promise of this universal community that language pretends to represent. It pretends to have a place for everybody to speak. Um, um, but I think that's also part of the hypocrisy of the law or the manipulability of the law. Remember all the patriarchal alignment with the law of all these characters, all these male characters. Um, that that I'll go into more detail and examine Felix and Safie's relationship in a minute. That the law can be, made to overlook particular situations and particular people, and that's what I think. That's part of what novels, can focus our attention on by imagining these particular scenarios, like this one right here, and the thing. The abstractness of the law. It's lack of that kind of fine-grained attention to the particulars of particular details of experience. That's just what novels give us, and in particular, this the experience of now. Our who we are, how we are just like in that movie scene just now. It's like love gets tested in the here and now. We can, in the abstract, define who we would be or what our values are, but we are what we do ultimately. And this is really emphasized here in this scene, especially this cry. Now is the time. If you're going to be something, you have to do it. At a certain point, it has to be enacted in life. It has to be enacted in a now. It can't just be an abstract sort of principle or potential. But it has to be manifest, like I've been saying about sort of manifesting ourselves in language. That manifestation is manifestation in time, in the real world, in some actual now. So again, the novel is giving us a kind of hypothetical exercise in this, application of social concern. So in that line, now is the time, I want to suggest that the text is giving us, representing a kind of temporality of love, not unlike, a piece of music, and not unlike that movie scene. That it's depicting love, the urgency of love as a compulsive, it's like, it's not something, it's not an intellectual choice. It's not something but something in a way that happens to you. Like, in the balloon scene, or, if you imagine, seeing a little kid walk across the street and in front of a car, and you don't think about it, whatever you do, if you um, run out to save the child. It's it's something that happens intuitively rather than intellectually, and that's a kind of intuition, the emotional, spontaneous emotional feeling that gets exercised in poetry and literature. Um, the so and that I'm wanting to suggest sort of it's an act of translating emotion into action, emotion in words, words into action, and this endless translation of sublime spectacles. Um, the sublimity of love kind of demands infinite translation. It can never be definitively represented, so all we can do is kind of endlessly evoke it metaphorically, allegorically, and actively in our actions in time. So these are all it's sort of allegories, ways of arranging time. See, the creature translating what he sees through the chink in the wall equals readers translating what they read on the page. Okay, so now I want to look at this theme as it applies to Felix and Safie's relationship. I think that's important little set piece. It's sort of the kernel of those embedded, interlaced narrators. That Safie's story is at the kernel, and there's something. This is another, I think, example of the rare glimpse into a non-patriarchal narrative in the novel, and therefore I think particularly important to pay attention to. So let's see. So there's a juxtaposition again of kind of politics and poetry, love and I don't know, politics, the law, on the one, law and politics on the one hand, poetry and love on the other hand. And so Felix, the backstory of Felix and Safie is that Felix has a political conviction leads him to take the side of Safie's dad, a Turk who's being persecuted in France and is on trial. But then he goes and he's smitten with his daughter, the Turkish merchant's daughter, and they start communicating by letter again, like love mediated by text. The zeal of Felix was warmed by several letters that he received from this lovely girl who found means to express her thoughts in the language of her lover by the aid of an old man, a servant of her father who understood French. And the creature says, I have copies of these letters. They will prove the truth of my tale. So that's pretty remarkable, I think. Like, not only is the love love letters, text translating love, but the letters themselves were translated. So again, this emphasis on thick mediation of affection between Safie and Felix, but then also the creature he maintains the letters as a proof of his own credibility. They would mediate his credibility to his to Victor, to his interlocutor. So again, this idea of prosthetic, like language is a prosthesis that mediates, embodies, and mediates who we are on the inside, our sentimental truth. Tainted love, Felix's loving horror versus Felix's violent delicacy. This see again how Felix of love and devotion are narrated. There's some ironic tensions or discrepancies. So the father of Safie had been the cause of their ruin. He was a Turkish merchant. He became obnoxious to the government. He was seized. He was tried and condemned to death. The injustice of his sentence was very flagrant. Felix had accidentally been present at the trial. His horror and indignation were uncontrollable. Again, it's sort of compulsive, spontaneous reaction. When he heard the decision of the court, he made at that moment a solemn vow to deliver him when he looked around for the means. So again, like just the reaction to seeing the child in front of a car, the balloon out of control. It's just a compulsive, instinctive reaction. It's not a decision, not a choice. But it's interesting to think his horror expresses the authenticity of his love, is expressed through horror. But listen to how his relationship with Safie is narrated, his affection for her. The Turk quickly perceived the impression that his daughter had made upon the heart of Felix, and endeavored to secure him more entirely in his interests by the promise of her hand in marriage, so soon as he should be conveyed to a place of safety. So he's effectively bartering his daughter. And Felix was too delicate to accept this offer. Yet, he looked forward to the probability of the event as the consummation of his happiness. So he's too delicate to explicitly accept her as, an explicit barter, her exchange, commodified something to own. But nonetheless, he's counting on it implicitly. His delicacy keeps him from doing it explicitly. He's too sensitive for that to do it explicitly, but implicitly he's relying on it happening anyway. So a Blakean irony and exposing supposed sensitivity, the violence underlying supposed ostensible sensitivity. So Shelley points out, the true virulence of patriarchy or, male privilege in case of Felix is expressed in what he doesn't say, that he just keeps silent and assumed that he will be able to take possession of Safie without having it overtly, explicitly to consent to it. I think it relates to this topic of the way in which bodies are silenced or disguised by language, or the way in which bodies are at stake in language. And it just points out a more general principle about ideology. Violent ideology works mostly by what it allows to go unsaid, not by, what it allows people to say. It allows people not to say, to get away with things with it. without having to assume it. Uh, so toxicity of patriarchy is more about implicit than explicit entitlement. So just for an example of like the capacity of language to disguise, or what officially gets acknowledged, explicitly gets acknowledged in social discourse, how much it hides. I think this is a pretty familiar graph about the discrepancy since the early 70s between productivity of work, average hour work, and the compensation. So I find this just really astonishing that productivity has been going up consistently since roughly after the Second World War, and compensation for the labor that required for that productivity had gone more or less in line with it up to a certain point, and then is basically leveled off, and all that the profit, the difference between these two has just been channeled to the top, the sort of capitalist class. So, but what's striking to me about this is what I want to point out is not so much the injustice of it, but its invisibility. That it's something that language, what counts as normal in this period of decades has disguised this. Here's another example. Unpaid domestic labor dwarfs even this, dwarfs even corporate profit. So if women were compensated for the amount of work they did at home, caring for relatives, if they're just compensated at minimum wage, it would dwarf the amount made, by imagine you had a bucket big enough to hold all the money made in 2018 by the 50 biggest companies. The 10.9 trillion that women didn't earn would more than fill it. So again, our capacity to ignore bodies, ignore the work, and to represent a certain state of affairs as normal, that is in fact vastly monstrously skewed. So it a certain perception of representation of normal that depends on the exploitation of certain bodies. Another sort of famous representation of rape statistics, the amount of reported rapes relative to the amount of rapes overall, relative to the amount that were actually prosecuted and jailed. So again, this monstrous reality of embodied experience, embodied suffering, it's disguised by it goes unsaid. It's disguised by what we don't feel the need to mention. So again, just the violence of silence, the violence that is implicit in just what we take to be normal. So what can we do about that? Such a distorted normalcy. such a violent, implicitly violent status quo. Well, I think that's something that is that Frankenstein is about. Um, so, again, going back to the question of Safie and Felix's romance, what is Safie to Felix? Something to own, implicit ownership. She's too delicate to admit it out loud, but precisely that delicacy is what legitimates the ownership. Um, that's so powerful, and that's really the object of especially Blake's critique, is how so much of our ostensible virtues actually just serve to legitimate systemic violence. So what's Felix for Safie? This, I think, is a very interesting question. For Safie, Felix is a dream to act on, embodied imagination. Indeed, his name means happiness. That, again, a juxtaposition of law and poetry, I think, is at play here. Owning versus reading beauty. Felix repeats the enslavement of Safie's mother, just as Safie repeats her mother's prophetic reading. So here's a really crucial passage. Really is that kernel narrative in that graph of embedded narratives. This is really the kernel, and it's about a non-patriarchal reading, a prophetic reading, prophetic imagination. Safie related that her mother was a Christian Arab, seized and made a slave by the Turks, recommended by her beauty. So just like Safie. She had won the heart of the father of Safie, who married her. The young girl spoke in high and enthusiastic terms of her mother, who, born in freedom, spurned the bondage to which she was now reduced. She instructed her daughter in the tenets of her religion and taught her to aspire to higher powers of intellect and an independence of spirit forbidden to the female followers of Mohammed. This lady died, but her lessons were indelibly impressed on the mind of Safie, who sickened at the prospect of again returning to Asia and being immured in the walls of a harem, allowed only to occupy herself with infantile amusements, ill-suited to the temper of her soul, now accustomed to grand ideas and a noble emulation for virtue. The prospect of marrying a Christian and remaining in the country where women were allowed to take a rank in society was enchanting to her. So she has inherited, just as Felix has inherited patriarchal privilege, entitlement, she has inherited her mother's prophetic dream of emancipation, broader imaginative prospects, intellectual prospects. Now, there's a couple elements that I want to draw your attention to in this passage that I think are really crucial. One is this idea of stamped. You know, the dream was stamped. Does that recall anything? It reminds me of the term stamp in Ozymandias. You know, the sculptor's reading was stamped on these lifeless things. It recalls printing, you know, like the printing press. A dream is mechanically stamped on the mind of Safie. It suggests how print can mediate dreams, and I think tells us something about the print we're reading. just like the word stamp, I think, makes us reflect on the print we're reading when we read that poem. The other feature of this passage that I think is really significant is the way in which it recalls the terms of Mary Wollstonecraft's critique of sexism in the vindication of the rights of women. The infantilization of women, in particular, is evoked with this idea of the infantile women that are restricted to infantile amusements. So I think there's a autobiographical, like, self-reference here that's really moving, and likewise the fact the lady died. Mary Wollstonecraft died giving birth to Mary Shelley, but transmitted a certain dream of personal liberty and the emancipation of women. So we see a kind of pattern here, this indelibly impressing the ink, the stamping of the dream upon the mind and implicitly upon the page in print. And this reflection, mother to daughter, the mother that dies bequeaths her dream to her daughter, Mary Wollstonecraft, to Mary Shelley. Likewise, as Safie transmits the dream onto the reader of Frankenstein, the Madame Saville. Translates, the sound translates, in the same, in a similar way to Safie's translated letters. And I think this sets up a pattern for the way in which we read the creature. We receive a kind of dream of a possible freedom, possible person in through the text, through our reading. Our minds might be stamped. We might imagine the possibility, create the possibility of a person, prophetically, poetically. We might channel this series of dreams, might be perpetuated through us. So again, we're getting instructed. It's an emotional education, and we're getting instructed how to read bodies, what it means to read bodies, practically finding strange new possibilities of reading. Prophecy means creating the form of readability. We're creating possibilities of reading, freedom, and personhood in new ways, imagining it in new forms of embodiment. So Frankenstein ultimately is about a dream that is ostracized from itself. It's about the perspectives of Safie at the center and Madame Saville at the periphery. Bodies that are excluded by the perspectives, the patriarchal narratives that dominate the novel itself. So in a way, the it's literally haunted, the novel, by the perspectives it excludes, by the bodies it excludes, maybe by our body. Maybe we're our own body. Our body, our own embodiedness, has more to tell us about the novel than, characters in the novel. One final sort of ostracized perspective you might consider. This inaugural horror novel, the most horrifying thing in it, if you ask me, is not the monster, but the monster's mate. And it's sort of enigmatic to even refer to her as a character, but I feel like we do. I feel like she's a potential character, but it's enough for us to imagine her as a character, to refer to her as a her. So what are we actually doing there when we imagine, this character that, I think she's kind of doubling down on the question of what we do when we imagine the creature as a character. She's, just a bunch of fragments that, they'd never cohered the way he did. But I think she's another version of the creature's ostracism as a wretch, as a monster. She's equally, I think what's so horrifying, and it really left an impression on me the first time I ever read this book, the scene of Frankenstein just tearing her apart, again, it's like he's creating the monster, the monstrosity that he accuses the creature of being. Again, the devotion to destruction of these patriarchs is really remarkable. But I just want to suggest that horror, remember Felix's loving horror, that horror teaches us something about what it means to care about people. So I think it's important to acknowledge the bride as another kind of outsider female body, the representative female body. Representative because she, like the others, is teaching us how to read what the patriarchal narratives ignore. Teach us to look for possibilities of personhood in what gets counted as waste in the official narrative, the official perspectives of characters within the novel.